Welcome to the Fishbowl Discussion of Emerging Professionals. That is truly a sentence with many foreign words, but I will explain them shortly. First, a few words about myself. My name is Franziska Prell, and I'm currently a research associate at the Chair of Restoration Science at the University of Bamberg. And today I am here as the moderator of this discussion. At the same time, I also represent the newly established regional group Scientists for Future Bamberg, which was founded at the University of Bamberg towards the end of last year. Just a few words about the discussion. As you can see, the seating has changed significantly compared to yesterday, and now there is an active inner circle. This circle consists of invited representatives from different disciplines of cultural heritage preservation. And the special thing here is that there are emerging professionals, meaning aspiring experts from various fields of cultural heritage preservation. And we feel very, very honored to have the chance to share our opinions on the current topic of adaptation strategies in this discussion circle. Around the inner circle, you can see that there is a more passive outer circle. This outer circle is what gives the entire thing its name, the Fishbowl Discussion. This means observing the discussion circle. However, it's also possible for the outer circle to participate in the conversation. There are 2 empty chairs within the inner circle, and that means that if someone wants to make a contribution to the discussion, then the person can just enter the circle and exit again after the discussion. So much for the introduction of the methodology, and now, of course, I would like to briefly introduce the participants of the first discussion round. I'll start with Miss Claudia Ecke. She initially completed her bachelor's degree in landscape architecture at the University of Gießen, and also completed her master's in development there. Since June 2022, she has been a scientific intern at the Staatliche Schlösser und Gärten Hessen, meaning State Castles and Gardens of Hesse, in the field of gardening. So welcome. The next speaker who is Annerike Heinz, who graduated as a diploma engineer in landscape planning and landscape architecture from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. Since January 2022, she has been a scientific intern at the State Castles and Gardens of Baden-Württemberg in the Historic Gardens Department, and she is currently working on various projects, including the Bundesgartenschau in Mannheim. Welcome. Next, I would like to introduce Sebastian Kruk. He initially studied architecture at the Technical University of Berlin and is currently doing his master's degree in digital heritage technologies here in Bamberg. And his master's thesis focuses on the cross-life cycle use of planning and building data. And additionally, he is also a research assistant at the Fraunhofer IBP for building physics in the field of cultural heritage research. Welcome, Sebastian. Janine Tessner studied landscape architecture in Hanover and worked as a student assistant in the field of history of garden art and monument preservation there. She is currently a scientific intern at the SI, which stands for Stiftung der Preußischen Schlösser und Gärten Berlin-Brandenburg, which is the foundation of the Prussian Castles and Gardens Berlin-Brandenburg. And we already met the well-known representative from there yesterday, Professor Dr. Rode. Welcome. Anja Wiegel pursued her master's degree in heritage conservation here in Bamberg after studying architecture in Nuremberg. She works as a freelance author, journalist, and artist, focusing on urban heritage conservation and heritage communication. And she's currently also a research associate at the Thüringisches Landesamt für Denkmalpflege und Archäologie, which is the Thuringian State Office for Heritage Conservation and Archaeology in Erfurt. She's working in the Department of TUB Procedures and Urban Heritage Conservation. So welcome, Anja. Next in line is Cosima Wörle, and after her bachelor's in civil engineering in Munich, she also completed her master's in civil engineering there, specializing in building physics, building design, and construction process management. She worked as a student assistant at the Fraunhofer IB and earned the additional qualification as a specialist planner for sustainable restoration of historical building substance in the Cavalli Bene program. And since February, she has also been a research associate in the Department of Energy Efficiency and Indoor Climate there. Welcome. Yes, so welcome to the Inner Circle. And as we've all noticed, this is a very diverse group. You all have very individual career paths. And your current positions are also very diverse and varied, covering a wide range. In relation to today's topic of adaptation strategies, I'm curious to ask whether you've had any exposure to this topic in your coursework, in your education, or in your studies. Do you maybe have specific examples, or do you see potential for expansion in this area in education? Well, I studied the master's program in heritage conservation here in Bamberg, and I can certainly say that the topics were indeed addressed. We had foundational modules that were mandatory for all students, and the topics were touched upon there, but they were really delved into in the elective modules. So, for example, at the time I was studying, there was a module called Specialized Knowledge, Heritage and Environment in the Sciences, which I found very interesting. And of course it varies depending on the program you're in, because I had previously studied architecture, and unfortunately I have to say that there were no attempts to integrate these topics into the curriculum, which I find quite unfortunate. So there is definitely room for improvement there. However, it's also important to acknowledge that to the same extent it's the responsibility of students themselves to specialize and continue their education in these areas, because there are also external training opportunities that one can take advantage of. I would like to add that in the field of architecture, from my perspective, there is a complete lack of engagement with existing buildings, and I believe that that's the initial mistake, or at least there was a lack of priority in that area for me. What has been done, however, is that building physics is covered in parts, which I find to be very crucial in addressing the issues. And I must say, here in Bamberg and Coburg, where the program is organized by both institutions, there are many events and opportunities to learn about these matters. In landscape architecture, I can also say that the topic of climate change and its consequences is consistently addressed and taught. And it's basically just something that we have to deal with. And during the internship, the voluntary internship, you learn how to practically implement these ideas, and you directly experience the measures that are taken. I agree, because I also studied landscape architecture, and that is what we can do, dealing with climate change, or at least that's what we should be capable of doing. Hence, it's a prerequisite for any planning. And it's no longer acceptable to ignore climate change or adaptation measures, which, yeah. However, what's a bit unfortunate is that in university we're often encouraged to break away from regulations, especially as the university is the only period where you can plan freely without external constraints. And it is told, or we are told, that if you have any ideas now, it is better to present them, because later you won't have the freedom to do so anymore. And that freedom won't come back. At the same time, this approach also makes you uncertain, and that's why it's a bit unfortunate that you're not required to react to anything. So as a result, it's not really an adaptation that we're doing, it's always a new design. So you can say that we have an empty space and we don't need to react to anything. So I would say that we have actually learned a lot about climate change, but we have never learned, for example, how to consider existing infrastructures, or even have problems, because in that free space, the space we're planning, these things don't even exist. So it's a bit of a shame, and that's exactly what we deal with during the internship. And we don't have a space full of new plantings that we can easily take care of, so I would say that these aspects complement each other quite well. And now perhaps a follow-up question. First, a note for everyone: sometimes the microphone seems to cut off strangely, so you could maybe hear better if you came closer to the inner circle, for anybody who has acoustic problems. But now I have another follow-up question. So in architecture studies, it's common to approach projects, especially new construction, with a lot of imaginative designs. So my question would be, do you also have the opportunity to evaluate adaptations, not only focusing on best practice examples, but also, for example, with this notion of maladaptation strategies that were implemented but didn't achieve the intended goals? Are those being discussed as well? So you mean negative examples? Yes, absolutely. Especially during excursions, for example, we look at a lot of negative examples. And of course, we try to create new solutions. Yes, definitely, and that's also a great way to present your own arguments, by examining projects and asking how it was possible that certain things weren't considered back then. So by looking at old examples, you have strong arguments, and I believe that especially in the planning of the 90s, a lot was planned without considering people, which resulted in these voids. So yes, definitely. So now I have the same question to the garden conservators in the inner circle. Yes, so in my case, the situation is a bit different, because I actually didn't have much interaction with this topic during my studies, at least not during my master's. In Hanover, in the bachelor's program, you study landscape architecture and environmental planning, so you touch on both fields. And this topic was, of course, mentioned in the fields related to the environment. But during my master's, it was a bit different, probably due to my specialization also. I had a lot to do with history and garden conservation, but from my experience, it was more of a side note. So it was briefly mentioned, like, yes, there is climate change and something is happening. But personally, I wish that even in such cases, it would be considered further, and that it's acknowledged that this topic concerns everybody. So it's not just about environmental planners, it's also relevant for landscape architects, for anyone in the field, including preservationists. And it shouldn't be an either-or decision. When I focus on historical gardens during my studies, I primarily look at the current state of the garden due to the guidelines. But what was it like back then? The reasons behind it, the impacts, how it used to be, and how climate change affects it. I think that was given too little attention to, in my opinion. So then I started my internship, and it was a whole different world. As I already mentioned here, I had direct exposure to practical aspects, and we had old trees dying one after the other, and there were different problems in the park, and the connection became much stronger, and it suddenly became more important, more relevant. And I must say that I don't want to label myself as somebody lacking knowledge in this field, but but sometimes I felt that way. Because there the information was like, this is how it is, this is climate change, and these are the problems that we're facing. And I thought, oh, well, that's much more than I initially thought if I didn't really think about it. Yes, so I completely understand. And so as a newcomer to the profession, you were basically thrown into it and had to deal with the risks and threats and damages of such massive scale. So it's also essential to build communication skills, to look beyond your own field. So this leads me to ask you to what extent you have had interactions with other cross-disciplinary actors in the cultural heritage sector. So in other words, the idea is that you can all speak the same language. To what extent was that a part of your education? Well, I studied civil engineering, and I must say that we had relatively little contact with other disciplines. There are, of course, joint projects with architects, but generally concerning cultural heritage or preservation, it was more like a side note, even regarding specialization areas. So it's almost impossible to delve into it significantly, and at university you're mainly trained as a specialist engineer to master your own discipline. But communication and how to interact with other disciplines is actually secondary. And I think that there is just not enough time allocated in the module schedule of the bachelor's and master's programs, for that matter. So much of it is based on voluntary participation, like taking additional modules, although the options are not always available either. And therefore, as a student, you often gain such experiences during your part-time work or internships, which provide much better opportunities to practice communication directly. I believe that many universities have the fortunate circumstance that there are related disciplines or programs that can complement each other well. For example, I studied my bachelor's in Nuremberg, where both civil engineers and architects are present. So here it's possible to coordinate things better and have modules that focus on collaboration. When I was studying myself, this wasn't the case yet, but I noticed that in later years there was more emphasis on this, which I find to be a good approach. However, there is still room for improvement. Of course, it's a good thing that in universities like Bamberg, for example, you can easily sit in on classes from other programs and organize this yourself. So this is what I actively did, and I can highly recommend to do it, because it's quite interesting. Now a direct question to Sebastian. You're also from the University of Bamberg. How do you see this whole situation? Well, I'd say that because the courses you can take are relatively diverse, you do gain some insights. However, I believe that these communication skills require a different level of emphasis. So this is not only about engaging with experts, but also with the general public. So, for instance, during renovation or architectural projects, this is a significant topic. And I experienced this for the first time with a design here in Bamberg, because in Berlin we never presented to non-experts. And I think that there was a significant deficit, so meaning not learning how to actually present our ideas, expose ourselves to criticism, and take feedback. So what about the garden preservation sector? I think that this is quite similar, because in the state palaces and garden sectors there are different specialized areas that come together. And I recently worked on a project with someone from another specialized area, and I realized that as a landscape architect I have a different fundamental knowledge about gardens, and sometimes it was challenging because I had to learn that certain terms or approaches weren't self-evident for the other area. I have to say that during my studies I could learn a lot, but I also learned a lot from the other side. However, I didn't experience much in terms of communication. I only got to do so through my practical experiences during my internship and through email exchanges and day-to-day communication. In our case, it was quite interesting because there was a mandatory module where landscape architecture and architecture students had to collaborate. So we were divided into groups and given a problem to solve, and that's when the issue of different languages and approaches really came to the fore. Because it took a long time for things to smooth out, and in some groups it simply didn't work because both sides were quite entrenched and said, well, my way is the only right way, and the other side responded, no, mine is the right way. So in some groups there was no actual collaboration. But when there is a willingness from everybody to learn from the other side and to share knowledge and not to cling to their own perspective, and sometimes might happen with the attitude of I know it and I have the monopoly and I won't share it, then it could work. So it was indeed sometimes a stressful experience, I must admit, but on the other hand, it was incredibly enriching as well. It brought different perspectives to light. For example, I was focusing on a garden and suddenly someone from the architecture field pointed out, but there's also a building there. And yes, to me that opened up new perspectives and even exciting ones. There was suddenly the sense of collaboration, listening to each other and learning from one another as well, which I find fantastic and also extremely important, and I think that would be beneficial wherever the possibilities exist to integrate such experiences into the curriculum and to teach and learn from them. So, in my opinion, you don't necessarily have to go as far as collaborating with architects. In our program, for example, all landscape architecture students have to choose a specialization. So we had options like nature conservation, open space planning, garden and landscape construction. And we had modules where it was mandatory to work in teams with these three disciplines, and even that was enough to cause conflicts. So it's exactly as you said. If you tone down your own stance, listen to the other side, you can truly learn from each other. But I find it quite fascinating also that everyone is essentially studying the same thing, and there are still such different areas. So it's no wonder that it's challenging to communicate on different levels. So one more brief question. Are there any questions or comments from the outer circle? Because we also have representatives from the younger generation here today. How do you perceive this? Yes, but this is not directly related to the question, but to the description shared by the landscape architect, because I found that quite interesting. So from what I understood, aspects of climate change play a role in teaching, in perhaps all subjects. And it is now an integral aspect of our thinking and planning. However, I believe that this should be further solidified. So from my understanding, there isn't a single university in the field of landscape architecture that has a professorship explicitly dedicated to climate change topics in their name. So for example, landscape architecture and climate change, or urban planning and climate change, architecture and climate change. So I wondered, does that exist? And if not, shouldn't be a given at all educational institutions? Well, there is such a professorship in Geisenheim, which Professor Kamen is responsible for. However, this isn't exactly specific to landscape architecture, because we also have other fields like horticulture and viticulture as well. But there is already a professorship in Geisenheim for that. I just wanted to briefly respond to that statement or present a contrasting view, because based on what we've heard, climate change is something that grows with teaching and something everyone is aware of. So I believe that we don't need to develop new study programs. We need to expand or evolve the existing ones. What I found interesting in the interdisciplinary aspect is that we need to engage with people from different areas to progress. And that's something that I'll take with me, because this is actually what we're doing in Bamberg through the master's program in heritage conservation, where people come together from all different backgrounds. And this is how we move forward. But I believe that we still should work on our communication skills in the future. Yes, and not only in other fields, but also toward the public, especially in terms of conveying the subject. This is particularly important, and we've heard this multiple times over the last 2 days in projects or thesis papers, that there's a gap in public knowledge, that it doesn't spread beyond our professional bubble. So I'd like to briefly summarize what we've heard so far, and Christina has already done a good job. But I also believe that these communication skills are essential for practical interaction, because this interdisciplinary work cannot happen without them. And this is where things often fall short, because we're also just often talking past each other. So this is where curriculum content comes in. I think that we should complement our education and studies with it, and it's already happening in many places, which is positive, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, in my opinion. So at this point, I would like to thank you for this first round of the discussion, and we'll carry this deficit into the second round. So in the second round, we will discuss the practical experiences of new emerging professionals. But for now, many thanks to all the participants and also external questioners. Exactly. So now I would like to welcome the next round. And I'd like to invite Mr. Andreas Buschmeier, who some of you have encountered today during our theme table Urban Green. You started unconventionally with a degree in early music in Nuremberg. However, you decided to pursue a career in construction. You completed your bachelor's degree in architecture at the Nuremberg Institute of Technology and then pursued your master's degree here in Bamberg. And then you did a scientific internship at the State Palaces and Gardens in Baden-Württemberg, where you've been working as a garden conservation officer since then. We also warmly welcome you to Bamberg as you have an external teaching assignment here in the master's program. And you are also involved in our Heritage Conservation Garden Application Week. So welcome, Andreas. Next in line we have Rebecca Haas, who initially studied architecture and urban planning at the Nuremberg Institute of Technology and also in Bern. So since completing your degree, you've been working at an architectural office in Bamberg, specializing in municipal project management, which means that you support communities and advise them on implementing urban development concepts, renovation, and citizen participation. You're also a member of the Green Party in Bamberg, where you've been a board member since 2019. Welcome. Next, we have Theresa Hilger, who studied conservation and restoration at the University of the Arts in Bern. So your career at the Bavarian State Office for Monument Conservation began with a scientific internship, and since then you've been a conservator specializing in paintings and sculptures. Your main focuses include not only conservation and restoration aspects, but also preventive topics such as light protection, monitoring, and climate control. I believe you've also had a chance to host the theme table Building Interiors earlier, so welcome. Next we have Manuela Hörmann. She completed her studies in restoration, art technology, and conservation science at the Technical University of Munich, with a specialization in the conservation of paintings and polychrome sculptures. You initially worked as a freelance restorer in Bavaria, and then you pursued a scientific internship at the restoration workshops at the Bavarian State Office for Monument Conservation, where you are now a scientific staff member. You've also taken on a DBU-funded research project on the conservation of anthropogenically damaged cultural heritage, together with Theresa Hilger. Welcome. Next, I would like to welcome Philipp Ludwig. So after completing your gardener apprenticeship, you studied landscape architecture at the University of Hanover. And since 2022, you've been a scientific staff member and garden conservator at the Gardens and at the Garden Heritage Conservation Department of the State Palaces and Gardens of Hesse. Your focus areas include formulating objectives and monument concepts in garden heritage conservation, as well as historical and contemporary site-appropriate plant use. So welcome. And finally, I would like to welcome Dennis Mitschke. After completing your bachelor's and master's studies in conservation and restoration of paintings and sculptures at the State Academy of Fine Arts in Stuttgart, you are currently a scientific staff member in preventive conservation at the University of Bamberg. Your research focuses on risk management in the cultural heritage sector and its communication. And you're also a freelance restorer, specializing in paintings, polychrome sculptures, and contemporary art. And as if that's not enough, you've also been very active in the Association of Restorers. And I also want to extend a warm welcome to the co-founding the Heritage Geeks Network. So welcome. So in the first round, we've heard that there is still potential for improvement in terms of integrating climate adaptation strategies or addressing climate change in educational curricula. Now, looking at it from the perspective of practical experience, are there opportunities for you to fill this knowledge gap through various projects or professional development? So I can speak from the perspective of architects. And there's the architect chamber. And as a recent graduate, you can benefit from reduced or free services for up to 8 years at the Architects Chamber. And I've been in this profession for about 4 years. And I've observed that over the past year or two, these topics have been gaining relevance in the offerings they provide. And regarding facades, greenery, or how to adapt interiors installation, what are the ecological solutions available? These aspects are all very building focused, and even though the chamber theoretically includes urban planners and should be responsible for that too, from the urban planning perspectives, I still don't see many opportunities, but especially in terms of buildings, there have been some developments. So another question is, does this focus mainly on new constructions, or does it also address existing buildings? So naturally, the focus is more on new constructions, but existing buildings is also a consideration. There are seminars for it, and the topic of facades and greenery is also focused on. So when I was studying, the topic of climate change wasn't extensively covered in our curriculum, but we did have preventive conservation, which addressed issues related to climate and museum collections. And I've noticed a stronger emphasis on this topic due to events like the flooding catastrophe in Atoll, and this has brought the topic more into focus. And as a result, risk management is being more strongly conveyed in universities as well. Now I'm focusing on this here in Bamberg. So of course, it's also in our favor that it's become somewhat of a trend word. So it frequently appears in the press for us, leading to inquiries. So we're asked by our restorers, do you have any examples? Where is the impact of climate change? What do you see? And from there, it naturally develops into a need for research and investigation, which is also supported and funded. And in our organization, we're fortunate to have a central laboratory that has been measuring climate for several decades, and we can sometimes refer back to the data as well. So it's something we're always happy about when we have a comparison of the past and today. So I would like to build on the topic of internships of the State Office. When I started in 2021, it was clear that there have been many conferences in this direction over the past few years, and the institution supported us in attending these events and being actively involved. For example, at the German Association of Conservators, there are volunteer associations where you can connect with volunteers from all over Germany and exchange experiences, including those from other fields like garden heritage conservation. So from the restoration field, we're somewhat the outliers in that group. For instance, I attended their assembly last year, and I was the only restorer there. And it was interesting to see what challenges other fields face. Sustainability and climate change were also discussed, and that highlighted the challenges as well. So I'd like to bring up the topic from earlier again, because communication is central here too. And from my perspective, during my studies, we were often in our own bubble. So it wasn't until later, through summer schools, that led to the creation of Heritage Geeks, that I encountered different perspectives. So humanities and what topics matter to people, and how do we find points of connections, etc. So the climate change topic actually offers us a great opportunity to engage in this discourse, because it affects everyone in some way or another, and we can explore how we can support each other in various ways. So Dennis, just another question. Could you briefly tell us about the Heritage Geeks? Because we've already mentioned it twice, but we haven't said what it is. Yes, so it's a group of friends that emerged from a summer school focused on design thinking and innovation in the cultural heritage sector. We had artists, restorers, architects, and everyone who was involved in some way with cultural topics. And one evening we sat down together and said, okay, let's do something and let's work together. And that's how this group was formed. So where we collectively examine various challenges in the cultural heritage sector, for instance. We also recently had a webinar on challenges in the job market, which is a significant challenge for us. And we are also training in communication, or just looking at what ways there are to improve that, among other topics. Since you mentioned communication earlier, I sometimes wish there was a platform where we could find all these different groups, specializations and working groups, because often I think that many are researching on fantastic things at the same time, and it's only when you know each other that you actually get to communicate and that you become aware of this. But, I mean, how often does a group like yours exist where someone then says, we should have a tool to gather this information, focus on specific themes, find contexts. It could include larger associations, foundations, and whoever else is involved. So, I don't know, is there such a thing, or should we create it? Well, for the field of garden heritage conservation, the European Garden Network might be going in that direction. They have really well-structured educational programs with various offerings, especially in the realm of garden heritage, which also addresses climate change issues. Also, as an addition to what Rebecca mentioned before, I'd also like to mention the Landscape Architects Chamber, which has been offering educational programs related to climate change in recent years. However, garden heritage conservation is slightly less represented, but it's still gaining traction. Otherwise, there are many organizations, but they often work independently, regionally, or nationally without high visibility in the field of garden culture in general. The German Society for Garden Art and Landscape Culture is relatively well known and serves as a voice in our field. However, there is, again, still room for improvement. And this relates back to the topic of outreach as well, because even though we have many amateurs involved, these associations could also serve as an interface to bring more of this information into society and to the general public. An idea that occurred to me earlier, as we often discuss in interdisciplinary aspects in communication, is maybe collaborating with communication experts. Because if we can effectively convey content, then perhaps we could work together with these experts to see if they could support us in this matter. And for them, it could be an interesting opportunity to generate content as well, maybe just as an idea. So at our state office, the situation is slightly different. because our role is more reactive when it comes to responding to applications or requests, for example. But we also have a project related to outreach and communication. So although it's moving away from climate change, it might still be relevant. And in Baden-Baden, for example, there are many villa gardens that are often threatened, partly due to various interventions, especially by the owner themselves, who want to build garages, tunnels, or whatsoever. So we are currently working on creating a guideline to understand what actually defines a garden and how we can best deal with it. So what to plant there and how to manage it, how to maintain its appearance, and also ensure that, for instance, a front garden along the street remain consistent and maintain their unity. And this is what we are trying to approach. So I have a question regarding something that was also mentioned yesterday about the guidelines or fact sheets. So the question is whether they really do have an impact, because how do you convey them to property owners, or how do you make them aware that these resources exist, and how do you convince them to take it seriously and also implement it? Well, yes, that's always a significant challenge. However, in Baden-Baden, which is also a World Heritage Site, there is a separate UNESCO office that supports us and spreads the information. And another factor is that there are already preservation regulations in place, and these contribute to improving and adapting this situation. In connection with Dennis's suggestion, it might be worth seeking professional support from communicators. Additionally, projects that produce materials like flyers could be useful, for example. And of course, we are responsible for communicating in our respective professions, but perhaps land offices or castle administrations could establish dedicated positions for professional communicators who could then convey our content. Yes, I would like to build on that. So I work at the State Office for Monument Preservation, and on the one hand, we as preservationists are already communicators for our concerns. On the other hand, beyond our own websites or even the websites of the VDL, we need to consider what effective multipliers are to disseminate the numerous excellent fact sheets that already exist or will be created in the future. So we are now currently working on a website to inform the general public. And we are also working on a new strategy to just give out this information in advance and reach out to property owners early. We will also link the various fact sheets available, including those from VDL, so to this platform to ensure wide distribution. And I believe that it's very important to consider who or what the multipliers are in different regions to achieve this dissemination. And I hope that we will succeed also here. So a follow-up question would be, are you using modern technologies, such as social media, for example, as one of these multipliers? And are you utilizing these platforms to involve younger generation as well? Well, that is definitely something that we should do. However, we're still in the early stages. But VDL, for example, has developed a new program in this direction. I believe that even when working with social media, it is essential to consider the target audience. For instance, the Association of Restorers also has a social media presence. The question, however, is whether we always reach the people that we intend to reach. Because usually we tend to reach our own bubble because we follow each other on social media, which is great. But how do we step out of our own circle? I think that's a central point that could still be worked on. So we really have to work on that. And even in our institution, we have a social media presence, which is supposed to serve as a means of communication. However, it's already a challenge to unite diverse interests such as archaeology, construction, art, and heritage conservation under one term, and to reach the same audience. So often we're active on social media we view the posts, we react positively and sometimes even negatively to them. But meanwhile, colleagues who might be in an older generation or not far from our age say, well, I don't use social media. And I think, how can we reach the target audience, particularly those who are a bit older, like church wardens or property owners who might still be a generation ahead of us? So I believe it's important to work on many levels and to develop best practice examples that are easily communicable with attractive images, perhaps focusing on specific aspects of our discussion. For example, projects involving photovoltaic installations or dealing with neighborhood solutions can be effectively disseminated, or single projects with well-illustrated visuals can help reduce apprehension about heritage conservation and our approach to cultural heritage sites, and also promote our field. I'd like to add something here because particularly the topic of these perfect examples is crucial because we also provide consultations for renovations, and this is especially true when it comes to funding for private owners and municipalities. So you can clearly see the prevalent trend in new developments using, for example, anthracite and white and everything looking the same. This is what people have in mind when envisioning new buildings or anything they're doing, because they haven't been exposed to such matters, not even in schools. So design guidelines are really helpful in this context, like flip through one, like how balcony railings can look, or how a photovoltaic installation can be integrated. For example, these are all the things that I think should be known from a professional point of view. And the general public just simply doesn't see the difference because builders and even those in different professions don't know about it. They haven't seen different possibilities. So it's important to realize that there's a lot of knowledge that's absent from the general population, and images help a lot. And there is no need to use complex jargon. Instead of saying, we'll apply a matte dark coating here, you can simply show them a photo. This is what it looks like in stainless steel, and it appears dark and layered, and etc. So in addition, it's essential to convey the heritage values right from the start. Also, a request is to summarize the heritage value of a building or a garden in a few words at the beginning, for example, so that we can derive what we should, why we should handle it a certain way. And this also fosters enthusiasm. It also leads to appropriate actions and practices in dealing with heritage sites as well. To quickly add to that, the theme is adaptation strategies, and perhaps we as researchers need to take a closer look at ourselves to become more involved in actual implementation and collaborate with local stakeholders. Also to see what their challenges are and how we can work together to solve them. we can think about it, and we attend numerous conferences, and we know that the topic is important because we theorize a lot, but what we need to do is get into concrete implementation, and that's what I have seen in many recent EU grant applications. So they seek concrete solutions, and I believe that we need to focus more on that too. So let me interject here. There is a concrete solution proposal that is currently being worked on at the University of Bamberg, which is focusing on communication. And there is a project called Klimakultus, where various workshops and formats are being designed to provide experts and students with tools to address this issue. And these workshops are specifically tailored to address different interest groups, also bearing in mind that many participants may not have a technical background. So you have to treat them differently from experts. Yes, to add to that, in our webinar with participants from different fields, it was mentioned that in the cultural heritage sector, it would be crucial to be trained ethnographically, as this would allow us to address gatekeeper individuals more effectively and thus also tap into entire communities. And this could also be introduced as additional training. Is there any further comments or contributions